My name is Josephine Calder. Everyone calls me Jo, except in one room in downtown Cincinnati, 4 days a week, where a courtroom deputy calls me Your Honor, and has for the past 3 years because I am a United States District Judge, appointed for life, confirmed by the Senate, and not one person in my family has ever known it. My mother thinks I file paperwork for actual judges. That is the sentence she has used to describe my career at every holiday dinner for over a decade, and I let her keep believing it, because the alternative meant a conversation I never had the appetite to have. Then, on a Thursday night in October, my sister hit a man with her car and drove 3 blocks before she stopped shaking long enough to pull over, and my mother called me at 11 at night and said 5 words that ended the silence I'd kept for 13 years. Just say you were driving. What happened over the following 6 weeks, in a federal courthouse my own mother has never once set foot inside, cost my sister the life she thought she was protecting, and cost my parents the version of me they'd built their whole family around, a version that never actually existed. It starts 26 years earlier, at a kitchen table, with a report card my mother folded in half without reading past the first line, and a sentence I have never forgotten. Welcome back to Frost Narratives, where quiet women finally let the truth stand up in the rooms that never made space for it. If you've ever built an entire life your family never bothered to ask about, this one is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. I grew up in a split-level house in a suburb of Dayton, Ohio, the younger of 2 daughters, and I want to tell you honestly, before anything else, that my parents were not cruel people in the way some families are cruel. Nobody in my house ever raised a hand. Nobody screamed. What happened in my house was quieter, and in its own way more thorough, because it didn't announce itself as unfairness. It announced itself as personality. My sister Bryn is 4 years older than me, and from the time I can remember anything at all, Bryn was the daughter my parents understood. She was funny at the dinner table in a way that made my father put his fork down to laugh properly. She was effortlessly pretty in school photographs, the kind of pretty that made teachers assume good things about her before she'd said a word. And she was, by every account my mother ever gave anyone who asked, going to do something wonderful with her life, though nobody in my family, including my mother, could have told you at any point over the following 3 decades exactly what that wonderful thing was supposed to be. I was the other kind of daughter. Quiet, exact, the kind of kid who read the entire encyclopedia set my grandfather left us 1 volume at a time over a summer because I liked the order of it, the way each fact sat in its place and stayed there. I brought home report cards with a column of A's so consistent that by 4th grade my teachers had stopped writing comments on them at all, because there was nothing left to say. I remember, specifically, a Tuesday in 6th grade, bringing home a report card with a note from my English teacher clipped to it, recommending I be moved up 2 grade levels for reading and composition. My mother sat at the kitchen table, unfolded it, read exactly the first line, the one with my GPA on it, said, "That's nice, Josephine," and set it face down on the counter to make room for the mail, which that day included 3 photographs Bryn's dance instructor had sent home of her solo at a regional competition. Those photographs went on the refrigerator. My report card went into a drawer I found, years later, cleaning out that house after both my parents had moved into assisted living, still folded in half. The teacher's note still clipped to it, never once read past the first line in 20 years. I don't tell you that story because I want your pity. I tell you because I think it explains everything that happened decades later, in a way nothing else could. Somewhere very early in my life, I learned that being exceptional in my family did not translate into being seen. My mother had one lens for measuring her daughters, and it was not intelligence, and it was not achievement in any form that couldn't be photographed at a recital. It was warmth, the kind of easy, room-filling warmth Bryn had been born with, and I had not, and no report card, no matter how clean, was ever going to correct that lens. So I stopped bringing the report cards to the table for approval. I started keeping my achievements to myself, quietly, the way you keep something valuable in a drawer instead of leaving it out where somebody might decide it doesn't matter enough to look at twice. I want to be fair to my father here too, because this story is going to ask a great deal of fairness from you before it's through, and I've tried to hold myself to that standard the whole way. My father, Harlan Calder, was not unkind. He was, more than anything, absent in the specific way some fathers are absent even while sitting at the same dinner table every night, deferring every judgment about his daughters to my mother the way he deferred every decision in that house to her, because it was easier, and because 30 years of marriage had taught him that disagreeing with Diane Calder cost more than it was ever worth. I don't think he set out to overlook me. I think he simply never noticed there was anything to notice, because noticing would have required looking somewhere other than wherever my mother's attention was already pointed. I went to Ohio State for undergrad, on a full academic scholarship my parents mentioned exactly once, at a barbecue, to a neighbor who'd asked, and then never brought up again in my presence. I went to law school at the University of Michigan, on loans and a research fellowship, and I remember calling my mother the week I got my acceptance letter, genuinely excited, wanting, the way you always want even after you've stopped expecting it, for her to be excited too. She asked me, in the exact tone she uses to ask about whether Bryn had heard back yet from the interior design program she'd been talking about applying to. Bryn had not applied. Bryn talked about applying to a great many things across those years, and applied to almost none of them, and my mother discussed every one of those unrealized plans with more enthusiasm than she ever once discussed a law degree from one of the top schools in the country that her other daughter had actually earned. Something hardened in me around then, not into bitterness exactly, though I won't pretend there wasn't some of that mixed in. It hardened into a kind of private discipline. I decided, somewhere in my second year of law school, that I was done performing my achievements for an audience that had already decided, years earlier, which daughter got to be impressive. I would build the career I wanted. I simply would not build it for them anymore. I would build it for myself, and for the version of the encyclopedia-reading girl at that kitchen table who deserved, at minimum, to know her own worth even if nobody else in that house was ever going to hand it to her. I clerked for a federal appellate judge after graduation, the kind of clerkship that opens doors in the legal world most people spend their whole careers trying to find. And I told my parents, when they asked, only that I'd taken a job doing legal research downtown, a description so flat and uninformative that my mother never once asked a follow-up question, which was, I think, exactly what some part of me was counting on. I became an assistant United States attorney 2 years after that, prosecuting federal cases, financial fraud mostly, the kind of work that takes years to build and rarely makes headlines, careful, exacting, the same discipline I'd learned reading encyclopedias one volume at a time as a kid. I told my family I worked for the government, doing legal work, and let them fill in whatever unremarkable picture that sentence suggested to them. My mother's mental image of my career, I believe to this day, was something adjacent to a courthouse clerk, someone who processed forms in a windowless office while real lawyers did the interesting parts down the hall. I was 38 years old when I received the phone call that changed the entire shape of my professional life. A vacancy had opened on the federal district court, and after a process that took the better part of 2 years, background checks, a formal nomination from the White House, a confirmation hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and finally a floor vote, I was confirmed as a United States District Judge for a district covering southern Ohio. I remember sitting in my apartment the night the vote came through, watching the tally on my laptop, feeling something I still don't have an entirely clean word for, some mixture of vindication and a strange, hollow loneliness, because the first instinct I had, the very first one, before I even called a single friend, was to reach for the phone to call my mother, and then to remember, with a clarity that stopped my hand halfway to the phone, that calling her would mean explaining 13 years of a career I had never once let her fully see. And that some part of me was terrified she would receive even this, a lifetime federal appointment, with the exact same flat indifference she'd given a report card recommending I skip 2 grades. I did not call her that night. I called my closest friend from law school instead, a woman named Priya who had watched, over 15 years, every quiet slight my family had ever handed me, and she cried on the phone the way I think a mother is supposed to cry when her daughter tells her this kind of news. And I let myself be held by that instead, because it was real, and because I had learned, a long time ago, to take my warmth wherever it actually showed up instead of waiting for it to arrive from the direction it was supposed to. My investiture ceremony, the formal swearing-in, happened 4 months later, in a courtroom filled with colleagues, my law school mentors, 3 fellow judges who spoke at the podium about my work on the fraud docket with a warmth that still catches in my throat when I think about it now. I did send my parents an invitation. I want that on the record because I think it matters, and because I've spent a long time asking myself whether I sabotaged that invitation somehow, made it easy for them to skip, and I've concluded, as honestly as I can, that I did not. I mailed it the standard way, on the court's own formal stationery, 6 weeks in advance, the way every other judge on that bench mailed theirs. My mother called 2 days after it arrived, not to say she'd be there, but to explain, in the same flat voice she'd used about the report card decades earlier, that the date conflicted with a spa weekend she and Bryn had already booked for Bryn's 40th birthday, and wasn't it a shame the courthouse hadn't checked with families before scheduling these things. I sat in a robe that morning, in a courtroom full of people who had shown up to watch me take an oath that would define the rest of my professional life, and my family sat, at that exact hour, at a resort 90 minutes away, toasting a birthday with mimosas, and I have never once told them, in all the time since, how that particular Saturday actually felt, because by then the pattern was so old, so worn smooth by repetition, that nomming it out loud felt like more effort than it was worth. I kept my chambers private. I kept my docket private. When my mother asked, occasionally, in passing, how work was going, I told her fine, busy, the same government job, still doing legal work downtown, and she never once pressed further, because pressing further would have required a curiosity about my life she had simply never developed the habit of having. Bryn, meanwhile, had spent those same 13 years, the way Bryn spent most decades of her life, moving from one enthusiasm to the next with a confidence that never seemed to require follow-through the way it would have for anyone else in that family. A marketing job here, a boyfriend who owned a boat there, a design certification she talked about for 8 months and finished the first 2 weeks of. My parents funded most of it, quietly, consistently. The way you fund something you've decided is simply an investment in a personality too special to be constrained by the ordinary rules of consequence. Bryn had 1 DUI already on her record by the time she turned 36, a night my parents handled with a private attorney and a plea deal that kept it off the kind of record anyone outside the family would ever see. An episode discussed at exactly 1 family dinner and never mentioned again, the way you discuss whether that's already passed. If you've ever watched a sibling get a second, third, fourth chance for the exact same mistake while you got measured against a standard nobody ever once explained to you, put the word measured in the comments below. I read every one of them. And stay with me, because the Thursday night that follows is the one where everything I'd spent 13 years keeping quiet finally had nowhere left to hide. I was in my chambers late that Thursday, working through a sentencing memorandum for a case I had on my docket the following week, when my phone rang at 11:15, well past the hour my mother usually called, which was, in itself, the first thing that told me something was wrong before she ever said a single word. Her voice on the line had none of its usual flat, managing calm. It was fast, thin, the voice of a woman trying to organize a crisis faster than her own hands could keep up with it. She told me Bryn had been in an accident. My stomach dropped the way it always drops at that sentence, the particular fear that has nothing to do with how a family has treated you and everything to do with the simple, uncomplicated fact that she is still your sister. I asked if Bryn was hurt. My mother said no, Bryn was fine, and then, in the next breath, delivered the sentence that told me this was not the kind of accident I'd first imagined. She hit someone, Josephine, a man crossing the street near that restaurant on 4th. She panicked. She drove a few blocks before she could even think straight enough to pull over, and by the time she did, she just sat there, and somebody else must have called it in, because the police are already involved, and Josephine, I need you to listen to me carefully, because we don't have a lot of time before this becomes something none of us can fix. I sat very still in my chambers, the sentencing memorandum still open on the screen in front of me, and asked her what she meant by fix. My mother's answer came out fast, rehearsed in the specific way a sentence sounds when someone has already run through it in their head a dozen times before dialing. The way you rehearse an argument you already suspect might not survive contact with the person you're about to say it to. She told me this would be Bryn's second offense if it came out that she'd been drinking, that a second offense combined with a hit and run could mean real prison time, not the private attorney kind of consequence the first one had cost her, and that Bryn's whole career, her whole future, could not survive that, not at 38 years old, not after everything she'd already been through trying to find her footing. And then my mother said the man Bryn hit was, as far as anyone at the scene could tell, going to be fine, banged up, a broken leg maybe, nothing catastrophic, and wasn't that, in the scheme of things, the only part that actually mattered? I asked her, again, carefully, what exactly she thought I could do about any of this. And my mother, at 11:15 on a Thursday night, in the same voice she'd once used to fold my report card in half without reading past the first line, said the 5 words that would end 13 years of a silence I had built one careful brick at a time. You have that same kind of car, Josephine. Same color, same year, nobody at that scene got a clear look at the driver in the dark. If anyone asks, just say you were driving. I did not answer my mother right away. I want you to understand what that silence actually was, because it would have looked, to her, like hesitation, like a daughter weighing the cost of helping her sister the way any decent person weighs a hard favor before agreeing to it. It was not that. In the 30 seconds, I sat there with the phone against my ear and my sentencing memorandum still glowing on the screen in front of me. I was doing the same thing I do every single day of my working life, which is running a set of facts against a body of law until I know exactly what they mean. What my mother had just asked me to do was not a favor. It was obstruction of justice, and depending on how the police were already framing what had happened on 4th Street, it was very possibly evidence tampering and accessory after the fact layered on top of it. And I knew every one of those statutes the way I know my own name, because I have spent 13 years either prosecuting people who did exactly this or sentencing them once they were caught. Welcome back, if you're joining partway through, to Calm Drama Stories. If you missed the first part, go back and start there, because this is the story of the night I finally had to choose between the family that never asked what I did for a living and the oath I'd taken to a courtroom they'd never once walked into. Drop a comment and subscribe, because this part is where the real cost starts showing up. I told my mother, as evenly as I could manage, that what she was describing was not something I could do, that it was not a matter of risk or courage, that it was a felony, plain and documented, the kind of thing that ends careers and puts people in prison regardless of how sympathetic the reasons behind it might sound at 11 o'clock on a bad night. My mother's response came fast, the particular fast of someone who has already decided the conversation is an obstacle rather than a discussion. She told me I was being dramatic, that nobody was asking me to hurt anyone, that all I would have to do was tell one police officer, if it even came to that I'd been the one behind the wheel, that a woman my age with a clean record and no history of trouble would never face anything serious even if it somehow did come out, not compared to what Bryn was facing with a second offense already hanging over her. I asked my mother, because I genuinely needed to know before I said anything else, whether she understood what she was asking me to walk into. She said she understood perfectly well, that she was asking her daughter to help her other daughter, the way family is supposed to help family, and that she had never once expected this kind of coldness from me, tonight of all nights when her other daughter needed her. I told her I was coming over. I hung up before she could answer. I drove to my parents' house in the split-level neighborhood I grew up in with the memorandum still unfinished on my desk, still thinking, the entire drive, about the specific danger of a family that has spent 30 years believing the law is something that happens to other people, the way weather happens to other people, an inconvenience you navigate around with enough charm and enough willingness to look the other way. I have sat across a courtroom from exactly that kind of family before, in my professional life, watching parents testify in defense of adult children who had done far worse than what my mother was describing that night. And I had always, in those cases, felt a professional distance from it. A careful, necessary remove that let me weigh the facts without the weight of loving anyone in the room. I did not have that distance driving to my parents' house that night. I had 13 years of practice keeping my professional life invisible to the exact people now asking me to use it as a shield for a crime. And I understood, somewhere around the third stoplight, that the two versions of myself I had kept so carefully separate for over a decade were about to collide in a kitchen with the same table where my report card had once been folded in half. Bryn was already there when I arrived, sitting at that same kitchen table, still in the dress she'd worn to whatever office event had preceded the accident, her makeup smudged from crying, a glass of wine in front of her that my father had apparently poured to steady her nerves, which struck me, even in the middle of everything else, as a strange choice for a family in the middle of a hit-and-run conversation, offering the driver more alcohol while discussing how to hide how much she'd already had. My father sat beside her, quiet the way he is always quiet, his hand resting on her shoulder, and I understood, walking into that kitchen, that whatever had been decided before I arrived had already been decided as a family, with me cast, in absentia, as the piece that would make the plan actually work. Bryn looked up at me when I came in, and I want to be honest that some part of me, even then, even knowing everything I knew about the law and about her history, and about the man lying somewhere in a hospital bed because of a choice she'd made, still felt the old reflex of wanting to fix it for her, the way I think most younger siblings never fully outgrow wanting to fix things for the sister who used to let them tag along. That reflex lasted about as long as it took her to speak. "Joe, thank God," she said, her voice thin and shaking in a way that sounded, even then, less like remorse and more like relief that a solution had walked through the door. "Mom told you what happened. It was so dark, I swear I didn't even see him step off the curb until it was already too late, and I panicked. I know I shouldn't have driven off, but I was so scared, and I just need this to not follow me for the rest of my life. You understand, don't you? You always understand things like this better than anybody." I asked her the only question that actually mattered to me in that moment, sitting down across from her at that table for the first time in longer than I could remember without an audience of some kind performed around us. I asked her how much she'd had to drink before she got in that car. She hesitated, and in that hesitation I got the actual answer, the way I've learned to get actual answers from people across 13 years of asking exactly that kind of question, in exactly that kind of tone. 3 glasses of wine over 4 hours at the office event, she said, followed quickly by an insistence that she'd felt totally fine to drive, that anyone would have felt fine after that amount spread out over that many hours, that this was really about a man stepping off a curb in the dark where nobody could have reasonably seen him coming, not really about her drinking at all. My mother stepped in at that point, the way she always steps in when a conversation threatens to sit too long on a fact she doesn't want examined too closely. She said the drinking wasn't the issue here. The issue was protecting this family from a mistake that could destroy Bryn's entire future over what was, in the end, an accident, the kind of thing that happens to good people every day, and that we, as a family, had always protected each other. And she wasn't about to start apologizing now for asking her daughters to keep doing exactly that. "We protect our own, Josephine," she said, the way she has said some version of that sentence at every difficult moment across my entire life, usually right before asking me to absorb a cost nobody else in the room was willing to carry. That's what this family does. It's what it has always done. I told her, as calmly and as clearly as I have ever said anything in that kitchen, that what she was describing was not protecting family. It was asking me to commit a crime on Bryn's behalf, a crime that would not disappear quietly the way the first DUI had disappeared quietly, because a hit and run involving injury draws a different kind of attention than a private attorney and a plea deal ever could, official reports, physical evidence, a victim in a hospital who was very likely, at that exact moment, describing to a police officer everything he remembered about the vehicle that hit him and drove away. My father spoke for the first time since I'd walked in, and I want to give him this much credit, because it is the only moment in this entire story where he said something that wasn't simply an echo of whatever my mother had already decided. He asked, quietly, whether I actually believed I could face any serious consequence for this, given how clean my own record was, given how quiet and careful I had always been about everything in my life. And I understood, hearing that question, exactly how little either of my parents had ever actually seen me. Not my career, not my choices, not even the basic shape of who I actually was, underneath 13 years of letting them believe whatever flat, unremarkable story required the least explanation. My father was not asking me to risk my future because he didn't care about me. He was asking me to risk it because he genuinely had no idea, standing in his own kitchen, what that future actually looked like. I did not tell them in that moment exactly what I did for a living. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters to the rest of this story. Some part of me, sitting at that table, still wanted to see whether the truth, the plain moral truth of what they were asking, without the added weight of my title attached to it, would be enough on its own to change their minds. I wanted, one more time, to find out whether this family could recognize a wrong thing as wrong without needing a federal judgeship, to make the wrongness feel important enough to take seriously. I told them, instead, only that what they were asking was illegal, that I would not do it, and that the right thing, the only thing that actually protected Bryn in any way that would hold up over time, was for her to call a real criminal defense attorney that night, be honest with the police about what happened, and let the process work the way it was built to work. My mother's face, hearing that, did something I had genuinely never seen it do before, a kind of open, undisguised anger that skipped past her usual careful management of a room and went straight to something raw. She told me I had always thought I was better than this family. Smarter, above the messy, human parts of loving people enough to protect them from their own mistakes, and that my coldness, the same coldness she'd been nomming in me since I was a child who preferred an encyclopedia to a dance recital, was finally showing itself in the one moment that actually mattered. If you've ever been told the boundary you were finally holding was proof you never really loved your family at all, put the word coldness in the comments below, because I have never in my life heard a word used more precisely as a weapon than I heard it used in that kitchen that night. And stay with me, because what my family did next, without waiting for me to change my mind, is the part of this story that took the decision entirely out of my hands. I left that house a little after midnight, having told them plainly, one final time, that I would not lie to police, that Bryn needed to speak to an attorney immediately, and that I hoped, genuinely hoped, she would do the right thing before the situation got any worse than it already was. I did not know, driving home, that my family had already decided, somewhere in the hour before I arrived, on a version of the plan that did not actually require my agreement at all. The man Bryn hit was named Desmond Iverson, 44 years old, a high school shop teacher walking home from dinner with his wife, and the injuries he sustained that night were more serious than the banged-up, broken leg my mother had described to me over the phone. He'd been thrown several feet by the impact, suffered a fractured pelvis, internal bleeding that required emergency surgery within hours of arriving at the hospital, and a head injury the attending physicians were still monitoring closely for signs of lasting damage. I did not learn any of these details that night. I learned them 3 days later, the way I learned almost everything about what actually happened, from a case file, because by then, the situation had already become something no family conversation was ever going to be able to undo. What I pieced together afterward, from Bryn herself, months later, in a conversation neither of us particularly wanted to have but both of us eventually needed to, was this. Sometime after I left that kitchen, my mother and Bryn decided that my refusal to lie directly to a police officer, should one ever ask me the question outright, did not actually solve their real problem, because the real problem was not what I would say if asked. It was what evidence already existed connecting Bryn's car to the scene. A witness near the restaurant had gotten a partial description of the vehicle and part of a license plate before it drove off, enough that investigators had already begun narrowing their search by the time Bryn got home that night. And my mother, understanding this faster than I think even Bryn did in her panic, decided the family needed to get ahead of the investigation rather than simply hopping it never arrived at their door. At 2 a.m, without telling me, without asking me one more time, without giving me any chance to weigh in on a plan I had already refused. My mother drove Bryn to the county sheriff's substation nearest their neighborhood, and Bryn walked in and told the officer on duty that her car had been involved in an accident earlier that night, that she wanted to report it before anyone accused her of something worse, and that the driver at the time had not actually been her. It had been her sister, visiting for the evening, borrowing the car because her own vehicle was in the shop, and Bryn had simply been too frightened and too embarrassed in the moment to correct the confusion at the scene. She gave the officer my name. I did not find out any of this until the following morning, when a detective named Renata Ochoa called my cell phone at 7:15, identified herself politely, and asked whether I would be willing to come down to the substation to answer a few questions about an incident involving a vehicle registered to my sister, Bryn Calder, the night before. She was courteous, professional, the exact tone I have heard 100 times in my own courtroom from officers testifying about routine interviews, and she had absolutely no idea, dialing that number from a case file that listed my occupation, thanks to whatever my mother and Bryn had told the officer at the substation the night before, as unemployed. That she was calling the chambers of a sitting United States district judge to ask that judge to explain her whereabouts during a felony hit, and run her own family had just pinned on her without her consent. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long moment after that call ended, my 13 years of careful, deliberate silence sitting in pieces around me, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after the chaos of the night before, that there was no version of the next conversation that was going to let me keep any part of that silence intact. I did not go to that substation alone, and I want to explain why, because I think it says something about the 13 years of discipline that had gotten me to that point in my life. Every judge I have ever respected has told me some version of the same lesson early in a career, that the moment you assume your own judgment is sound enough to skip proper process, you have already made your first real mistake. So before I drove anywhere that morning, I called a friend from law school named Desmond Acaffer, no relation to the man my sister had hit, a criminal defense attorney with 20 years of experience and a reputation for discretion, and I asked him to meet me there, not because I believed I needed defending, but because I understood with total clarity that a sitting federal judge walking into a police interview connected to a felony hit and run needed every single step of that morning documented, witnessed, and beyond reproach, regardless of how the facts eventually shook out. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. If you're joining partway through this one, go back and start at the beginning, because this is the story of the morning 13 years of silence finally caught up with an entire family in one room. If it's speaking to you, drop a comment and subscribe, because this part is where the truth stopped being something I could manage quietly. Detective Renata Ochoa met us in a small interview room with the kind of tired, professional patience I recognized instantly from 100 officers I've cross-examined, and 100 more I've listened to testify with genuine, unglamorous care about cases nobody outside a courtroom will ever hear about. She had my file open in front of her, the one built from whatever Bryn and my mother had told the officer at the substation the night before, and she began, politely, by asking me to walk her through my whereabouts the previous evening, specifically whether I had been driving my sister's vehicle at any point. I told her, plainly, that I had not been driving that vehicle, that I had not seen my sister at all until close to midnight, well after the incident in question, that whatever information had been given to the officer on duty the night before nomming me as the driver was false, and that I wanted to be completely clear, on the record, exactly how and why that false information had come to be in her file. I watched Detective Ochoa's expression shift as I spoke, not dramatically, but the way a professional expression shifts when the facts of a case start rearranging themselves faster than the paperwork can keep up. She asked, carefully, for my full legal name and my occupation, standard questions in any interview, and I gave her both, the way I would give them to anyone asking under the same circumstances, without embellishment and without apology. Josephine Calder, United States District Judge, Southern District of Ohio. She set her pen down. I want to tell you honestly that I did not enjoy that moment the way you might expect, watching someone recalibrate their entire understanding of a conversation in real time. I felt, mostly, a kind of tired relief, the particular exhaustion of finally saying a true sentence out loud after holding it back for so long that saying it felt almost physically strange in my mouth. Detective Ochoa asked me, once she'd recovered enough to speak again, whether I was aware that my occupation, per the report filed the night before, had been listed as unemployed. I told her I was not aware of that specific detail until that exact moment, but that it fit, unfortunately, with everything else about how the previous night had gone. She asked, next, the question I had been expecting and dreading in equal measure, whether I had any knowledge, at the time my sister and mother went to the substation, of what they intended to tell the officer on duty. I told her the full truth. Because there was no version of my career or my character that could survive anything less. I told her that my mother had called me directly the night before and asked me to falsely claim I had been driving, that I had refused, in person, at my parents' house, and told them plainly that the correct course of action was for Bryn to speak with an attorney and be honest with police about what had actually happened. That I had left that house believing my refusal had ended the matter, and had no idea, until Detective Ochoa's phone call that morning, that my family had gone to the substation anyway and given a false statement using my identity without my knowledge or consent. Desmond, sitting beside me, made sure that entire account went into the record clearly and completely, because he understood, the way I did, that the difference between what actually happened in that kitchen and what a less careful telling might imply was the difference between a judge who had been victimized by her own family's panic and a judge who had somehow been complicit in a cover-up before finally coming clean. I wanted no ambiguity left in that room about which of those two stories was true. Detective Ochoa told us, once the interview concluded, that the false statement given the night before changed the entire posture of the investigation, and not in Bryn's favor. A hit and run causing serious injury was already a felony under state law. Filing a false police report, one that named a specific individual, a sitting federal judge no less, as the driver in an attempt to shield the actual driver from consequences, added an entirely separate charge. And given the identity involved, she suspected this case was about to receive a level of scrutiny from the district attorney's office that a quieter hit and run involving an anonymous family might never have attracted at all. My family's plan to protect Bryn by dragging me into it had, in the space of one panicked midnight decision, made the entire situation dramatically worse. I asked, before we left that room, about the man Bryn had hit. Detective Ochoa told me his name for the first time. Desmond Iverson, 44, a high school shop teacher. She told me the surgery had gone as well as could be expected given the severity of the pelvic fracture, but that he would likely need months of physical therapy, and that the head injury was still being monitored closely enough that his doctors weren't yet willing to rule anything out. I sat with that information the entire drive home, thinking about a man I had never met, walking home from dinner with his wife, doing nothing wrong at all, and a family 2 blocks away spending that same evening trying to figure out how to make the consequences of hitting him land on anyone other than the person who'd actually been behind the wheel. If you've ever watched people you love treat a stranger's suffering as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a fact to be reckoned with, put the word Iverson in the comments below, because I think that man's name deserves to be remembered by more people than the ones who read a case file. And stay with me, because what happened when I finally told my family the truth about my career is the part of this story I have replayed in my head more than any other. I called the chief judge of my district that same afternoon, a formality I owed the court regardless of my own innocence in the matter, because any situation involving a sitting judge's name in a criminal case, even peripherally, even as the wrongly accused party, needed to be disclosed properly rather than left for someone else to discover later and wonder why I hadn't said anything. She was gracious about it, told me the court's ethics council would review the matter as a formality, and agreed immediately with my own instinct that I should have no involvement whatsoever, formal or informal, in anything related to my sister's case going forward. Not a phone call, not a conversation with a prosecutor, not so much as a passing comment to anyone in that office, to ensure there could never be even the appearance that my position had influenced how the case was handled. I want to tell you plainly that I did not find that decision difficult. I had spent 13 years keeping my professional life separate from my family precisely because I understood, long before any of this happened, that the two should never be allowed to touch each other in a way that compromised either one. My mother called me 4 times that afternoon before I finally answered, because I needed the hours in between to decide exactly what I was going to say, and because some part of me, even then, was still working out whether there was a version of this conversation that didn't end with everything between us permanently rearranged. When I finally picked up, her voice had none of the fast, managing panic from the night before. It was quiet, almost small, the voice of a woman who had spent the day getting phone calls she did not understand, from an attorney, from a detective, from her own daughter's colleague explaining, patiently, exactly what kind of trouble the family had walked into. "Josephine," she said, "is it true? What that detective told your father, that you're a judge, a real federal judge?" I told her yes. I told her I had been confirmed 3 years earlier, that I presided over a full docket of federal cases 4 days a week, that I had sent her an invitation to my investiture ceremony that she'd missed for a spa weekend, and that I had simply stopped correcting her assumptions about my work somewhere around the 5th or 6th time. She'd changed the subject to Bryn before I finished a sentence about my own career. Because correcting her had never once seemed to matter to anyone in that house as much as it apparently mattered now. At the exact moment, it might have been useful to them. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I checked the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. When my mother spoke again, her voice had shifted into something I recognized instantly, because I had heard versions of it my whole life, the sound of a woman recalculating a situation rather than actually absorbing what she'd just been told. She asked whether, given my position, there was anything I could do quietly to help Bryn's case go more smoothly, whether I knew people in the prosecutor's office who might be willing to consider the family's circumstances, whether a judge as respected as I apparently was could simply make a call and explain that Bryn was fundamentally a good person who had made one terrible mistake under pressure. I sat with that request for a long moment before I answered, because I understood, hearing it, exactly what my mother had actually absorbed from the last 24 hours. Not that her daughter was a federal judge who had built an entire career on integrity while her family looked the other way for 13 years. Only that her daughter now had a kind of power that might finally be useful, the way Bryn's warmth had always been useful, the way every quality either of her daughters possessed had only ever mattered to her insofar as it could be spent on something the family needed. I told her, as plainly and as finally as I have ever said anything to her, that I would not make a single call on Bryn's behalf, not because I did not love my sister, but because the entire meaning of the oath I had taken 3 years earlier was that I did not use my position to bend outcomes for anyone, especially not for my own family, and that asking me to do exactly that, less than a day after I had already refused to lie for her once, told me my mother had learned absolutely nothing from the last 24 hours, except that the version of me she'd never bothered to know might, after all, be worth something to her. She told me, her voice rising now, that she did not understand why I was choosing again to punish this family for asking for help, that a mother was allowed to want to protect her child, that surely a judge of all people understood the difference between mercy and cruelty. And I told her, because it was the truest sentence I had in me at that moment, that mercy belonged to the courts, to a process built specifically to weigh circumstances fairly, and that what she was asking for was not mercy. It was an exemption, purchased with my name, the same way she'd once tried to purchase it with my silence, and I was done being the currency this family spent whenever the truth became inconvenient. "We protect our own, Josephine," she said again, quieter this time, less like an argument and more like a woman repeating a sentence she'd said so many times across 3 decades that she no longer entirely knew what it meant without the momentum of repetition behind it. I told her I finally understood exactly what that sentence had always meant in our family. and that I was done being the one who paid the bill for it. My father called 2 days later, not to ask for anything, which was itself unusual enough that I nearly didn't recognize the shape of the conversation. He asked, quietly, whether he could come see my courtroom sometime, watch a real session, the way you'd ask permission to see a part of someone's life you'd spent years assuming didn't exist. I told him yes, that he was welcome anytime a public session was in session, and I meant it, though I want to be honest that I did not yet know, hanging up that call, whether this was the beginning of my father finally seeing me clearly, or simply one more instinct toward managing a situation he still did not fully understand. Bryn's attorney reached a plea agreement with the district attorney's office 6 weeks later, a process I learned about only through the same public channels anyone else in that county could have accessed, because I had kept my promise to myself, and to the chief judge completely, no calls, no conversations, no involvement of any kind, formal or otherwise. What that agreement looked like, and what it cost my sister in the end, is not a story I can tell you secondhand the way I've told you everything up to this point, careful and reconstructed from documents and testimony. It is a story I watched happen from the outside, the way anyone in that family had to watch it happen, in a courtroom that was not mine, in front of a judge who was not me, exactly the way it should have been from the very first phone call, if anyone in my family had simply told the truth on the night it mattered most. The plea agreement between Bryn and the Montgomery County District Attorney's Office was finalized on a Tuesday morning in early December, and I learned about its terms the same way anyone else in that county could have learned about them, by reading the public docket, because I had kept every promise I made to myself, and to the chief judge of my district in the 6 weeks since Detective Ochoa first called my cell phone at 7:15 in the morning. No calls. No conversations with anyone in that office. No favors asked or offered, quietly or otherwise, in either direction. My sister's case moved through the system exactly the way it would have moved for anyone else's sister, and I want to tell you honestly that watching it happen that way, from a distance I had chosen and defended even when it cost me something, was the single proudest thing I did across this entire ordeal. Welcome back for the last time on this story to Calm Drama Stories. If you've stayed with me since the beginning, thank you, because this is the part where all of it finally settles into what it actually cost and what it finally built. If you're new here, drop a comment, subscribe, and settle in for the ending. Bryn pled guilty to leaving the scene of an accident involving serious injury and to filing a false police report, the second charge added directly because of the statement she and my mother had given the night of the accident, nomming me as the driver. The prosecutor, a careful, unhurried woman named Alicia Ferris, who I never once spoke to during the entire process, later told a local reporter, in comments made after the sentencing rather than during it, that the false report had been an aggravating factor she took seriously, not because a judge's name had been used, but because it represented a deliberate, calculated attempt to obstruct an investigation into a man who had nearly died on a sidewalk, and that the office did not treat that kind of calculation lightly regardless of who happened to be standing at the center of it. The original DUI charge from the accident itself did not survive, in the end, the way my mother had feared it might, because the delay between the accident and Bryn's eventual cooperation with police meant the blood alcohol evidence that might have supported it had degraded past the point of reliable use, a detail I want to be honest about, because I think it matters that you understand this story does not end with every possible consequence landing exactly where it should have. The system is not perfect. It is only, at its best, honest about its own limits. What Bryn did receive, as part of the negotiated sentence, was 18 months in the county correctional facility, followed by 3 years of probation, a permanent revocation of her driving privileges for the duration of that probation, and a restitution order tied to Desmond Iverson's medical expenses, calculated by the court at just over $90,000, payable on a schedule that would take her years to complete even with our parents' help, which they offered immediately and which the court, notably, did not treat as a substitute for Bryn's own accountability, only as a supplement to it. I attended the sentencing hearing. I want to explain why, because I think it's the one place in this story where the line between Judge Calder and Joe, the younger daughter who used to read encyclopedias at a kitchen table, finally blurred in a way I found I could live with. I did not attend as a judge. I sat in the gallery, in plain clothes, 3 rows behind my parents, the way any family member attends any hearing, because I had decided, somewhere in those 6 weeks, that showing up for my sister as a sister quietly, without a single word spoken to the court, without so much as a nod toward the bench that might be misread by anyone watching, was not the same thing as intervening in her case. It was simply being present for the hardest morning of her adult life, the way I think most people, whatever they've done, deserve at least one person in the room who came only to witness, not to fix. Bryn saw me when they brought her in, and something in her face in that moment was different than anything I'd seen from her across the entire ordeal. Not the panic from that first Thursday night, not the practice charm she'd used at that kitchen table trying to enlist me. Something quieter, and I think, more honest than either of those. She mouthed the words "I'm sorry" across the courtroom, and I nodded once because I believed her, and because believing her did not require me to have done anything differently across the previous 6 weeks. The judge who presided over that hearing, a state court judge named Marcus Farrell, who I had never met before that morning and have not spoken to since, addressed the false report specifically in his remarks before sentencing. And I want to tell you the exact sentence he used, because I have thought about it many times since, sitting in that gallery 3 rows behind my parents. He said that a family's instinct to protect one another was not, in itself, a wrong instinct, that it was in fact one of the more understandable impulses a court sees in cases like this one. But that protection built on a lie inevitably cost someone else the truth. And in this case, it had very nearly cost an innocent woman her own reputation and possibly her career. A woman who, he noted, happened to hold a position that made the stakes of that particular lie unusually visible, but whose fundamental unfairness would have been exactly the same had she been anyone else in the world. My mother cried through most of that hearing, quietly, into a tissue she kept twisting in her lap, and I want to be honest that I did not feel triumphant watching her cry. I felt mostly a kind of tired grief for the family I had once badly wanted us to be, the one that might have handled that Thursday night with honesty instead of panic, the one that might have called Bryn's attorney at 11 o'clock instead of driving to a substation at 2 in the morning, with a plan built entirely around sacrificing whichever daughter's life seemed most expendable to spend. Desmond Iverson, the man Bryn hit, appeared at the sentencing as well, walking with a cane, his wife beside him, and he gave a victim impact statement that I will not try to reproduce for you word for word, because I don't think it's mine to summarize casually the way I've summarized everything else in this story. What I will tell you is that he spoke about the months of physical therapy still ahead of him, about a semester of teaching he'd had to give up because he could no longer stand at a workbench for the hours the job required, about the specific, ordinary fear that now lived in him every time he had to cross a street. A fear he said he expected to carry for the rest of his life, regardless of what happened in that courtroom that morning. And then he said something I have not been able to stop thinking about since, that he did not come to that hearing wanting to see anyone destroyed, only to see the truth finally treated as more important than anyone's comfort, because the night it happened, comfort was the only thing anybody but him seemed interested in protecting. I introduced myself to him afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, not as a judge, only as Bryn's sister, and I apologized to him directly, on my own behalf, for what my family had tried to do with my name in the hours after he was hurt. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said something I think about often now, that he appreciated the apology, but that the person who actually owed him one had already given it, in her own way, by pleading guilty instead of fighting the charges the way some families with the resources to hire the right attorneys might have chosen to do instead. I don't know if that's a fair reading of what Bryn's plea actually cost, or didn't cost her in terms of genuine remorse versus practical calculation. I only know it's the reading Desmond Iverson chose to give it, and I decided, standing in that hallway, that it was not mine to argue with. If you've ever had to sit in a room and watch the actual cost of a lie land on people who never asked to be part of it, put the word Iverson in the comments one more time, because I want his name to be the thing people remember from this story more than any of the rest of it. And stay with me just a little longer, because I want to tell you honestly where things stand with my family now, because I think that honesty is the only ending worth giving you. My mother and I speak, these days, in a way I would describe as careful rather than close. She has not, in the year since Bryn's sentencing, ever fully acknowledged, in the words I think I once wanted from her, that asking me to lie to police was wrong in the way I needed her to understand it was wrong, that it was not simply a bad idea that happened not to work, but a fundamental failure of the values she'd always claimed to have raised her daughters with. What she has done, instead, in the smaller, more grudging way I have learned, is probably the most this particular woman is capable of, is stop introducing me, when the subject of my work ever comes up now, as someone who does legal work downtown. She tells people, when she has to, that her daughter is a federal judge, and I have noticed, watching her say it at 2 family gatherings since the sentencing, that she still says it with a kind of surprise in her own voice, as though the sentence belongs to someone else's life she's borrowing for the occasion. I don't know if that surprise will ever fully resolve into something closer to pride. I have decided, across this last year, that I am no longer going to spend my energy waiting to find out. My father did come watch a session in my courtroom, 3 months after Bryn's sentencing, sitting quietly in the public gallery through an afternoon of civil motions that I imagine, to someone outside the profession, must have looked almost unbearably dry. Dockets and filings and careful procedural arguments with none of the drama people expect from television. He waited for me afterward in the hallway outside my chambers, and he told me, in the same quiet, deferential voice he's used for most of my life, that he hadn't understood, until that afternoon, watching me on the bench, exactly what it meant that people stood up when I walked into a room, that they called me Your Honor and meant it. That an entire courtroom full of strangers organized itself around the authority of a woman he had spent 40 years quietly assuming was the less remarkable of his 2 daughters. He said he was sorry. I believed him more than I believed my mother's version of the same sentence, not because his love was greater, but because his was the only apology in that entire family that did not arrive already looking for something in return. Bryn is out now, 6 months into her probation, working a job at a nonprofit that helps families navigate the aftermath of DUI convictions. A job I did not arrange, did not know about until she told me herself, and did not entirely believe at first, was more than one more version of the enthusiasm she has cycled through her whole life without much follow-through behind it. I have been wrong about that, so far, for 6 months running, longer than any of her previous enthusiasms ever lasted, and I am choosing, carefully, the way I choose most things now where my family is concerned, to let that be true for as long as it keeps being true, without needing to decide in advance whether it will last. I still keep my robe in the same closet at Chambers I always have, and I still, most days, come home to an apartment where nothing on the walls announces what I do for a living, because I have learned, across 13 years, and then this last difficult one, that the version of myself I built quietly, without an audience, was never actually a smaller version of who I could have been if my family had simply paid attention sooner. It was, I think now, the only version sturdy enough to survive what eventually happened to it, a version built to hold its own weight regardless of whether anyone in that split-level house ever noticed it was there. I sentenced a man last month in an unrelated federal case for wire fraud, and before I read the sentence into the record, I told him something I have never said from the bench before, though I suspect I will say some version of it again. I told him that the law does not exist to punish people for being afraid. It exists to hold a line steady enough that the people standing on either side of it, the ones who did wrong and the ones who were wronged, can both trust that the truth, however inconvenient, will eventually be the thing that decides what happens next. I was thinking, saying it, about a kitchen table and a folded report card, and a mother who once asked her quiet daughter to disappear into a lie, so her other daughter wouldn't have to face the truth about what she'd done. I did not tell that man any of that. Some things belong only to the family they happened in, even after you've told a story this openly. But I meant every word of it, on the bench that day, more than I think I have ever meant anything in a courtroom before. That's my story. One phone call at 11:15, one false report with my name on it, and a family that finally had to learn who I actually was because they needed something from me instead of asking. If you've ever built a whole life quietly because the people who were supposed to notice never did, take this as your sign that the noticing was never actually the point. Share this with someone who's still waiting for their family to finally look up. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.